In this video, Jordan Peterson explains the best way to conceptualize reality.
Every theory is set within a set of assumptions. Things that you have to assume to be true in order to proceed with the theory. They're like the axioms in classical geometry. You can't prove the axioms, you have to accept them. Once you accept the axioms, then you can move forward and use the whole system. I think the reason that systems have to have axioms, which are elements of belief, is because every system is incomplete, right? It doesn't cover the entire world. And so, in some sense, you need a place to dispense with your ignorance, and the way you do that is by making assumptions. We're going to act as if the following is true. And then you can proceed with a partial theory and you'll have some success with it. But it's useful to understand the presuppositions, because it orients you properly towards the theory. Now, Rogers is a phenomenologist, and phenomenology is a brand of philosophy which I believe started with Edmund Husserl, but was probably made most influential by his student Martin Heidegger. Now, Heidegger was a philosopher, I suppose, somewhat like Nietzsche, in that he was very much, his thinking ran very much counter to what you might describe as general academic philosophy. For example, Heidegger believed that ever since the time of Plato, which is when people think philosophy began, more or less, Western philosophy had taken an erroneous direction. It had become too concerned with the nature of structures of thought and not concerned enough about the nature of being. And so you can determine those two things. Being is how things are, and thought, of course, is how you represent things. And one of Heidegger's missions was to reestablish being as the central reality of philosophy. Now, that begs a question, which is, what is being? Well, to conceptualize reality as being is not to conceptualize it the same way that you conceptualize it in terms of modern Western thought. Because one of the presuppositions at the basis of modern Western thought is that the most intelligent way to divide up the world is in terms of subjective and objective experience, or subjective experience and objective world. So the fundamental scientific presupposition, you might say, is that there is an objective world. It's the real thing. You come to that by performing certain procedures, documenting them, describing the outcome of those procedures, documenting them, and then allowing other people to do the same thing, operating under the presupposition that if they experience the same outcome from the procedures, then what they're experiencing is real. That's basically the scientific method, right? Method, results. You detail the method, which is how you act on the world, you get the results. You compare them, maybe across multiple observations that you do, and then other people do multiple observations, you come up with a consensus. But it's a method-bound consensus. And then, of course, you abstract out general principles from that. And it works very powerfully, right? Make no mistake about it. The idea that there is an objective external world and that that's the best way to conceptualize reality is an unbelievably powerful tool. Now, whether or not it's an accurate description of reality, that's a much more difficult question. And it's partly a matter of definition, actually. You know, it's the case that there are different forms of geometry. You might know this. You can start from the presupposition that reality has a three-dimensional structure, and then you're basically within the realm of Euclidean geometry, but you can also start with the presupposition that reality has a four-dimensional structure, and that kind of geometry was invented in the late 1800s, and it turned out to be the perfect geometry to describe the universe that Einstein conceptualized when he came up with his great theories in the second decade, thereabouts, of the 20th century. So it's interesting because you can start from different assumptions, build tools on the basis of those assumptions, and sometimes you find out that those tools work very well indeed. Now, it's not that easy to think of flaws in the subjective experience, objective world conceptualization. And that's partly for us as modern people, it forms the basis of so much of what we think that we just think about it as axiomatic. It's just true. It doesn't bear any question. But I'm going to offer you a couple of examples of why it might bear some questioning, and you can think about it. The first problem is that the classical scientific view of the world has a very difficult time accounting for certain things. So, for example, these are called qualia often by people who are interested in consciousness. So, knowing the wavelength of light doesn't seem to tell you much about the subjective experience of color. You know, we experience color, for example, in a non-continuous fashion, right? Because we see discrete colors like you'd see in a rainbow. I mean, they shade into each other to some degree, but it's not like they go from light red to dark red in a continuum. There's clear demarcations of color. Well, that's because of the way your brain is wired. You know, it seems like over the course of evolution, what we've learned is that parsing up that wavelength fragment in terms of categories, which would be the different colors that we see, has substantial practical utility. Now, one of the things you might ask is, well, do those colors exist? Well, objectively, they don't seem to exist as colors, partly because the wavelengths that we see are actually continuous. So when one color shades into another, there's no radical transformation in wavelength. It's a continuum, but we see it categorically. Okay, so is that real or not? Are the colors we see real or not? Well, that's a good question. You can't get a collective experience of pain, like you can get a collective experience of the blackboard. But pain seems to be something that's limited to subjective perception. But it's very difficult. No one acts as if pain isn't real. I mean, I would say that of all the things that you might consider real, we act as if pain is the most real thing. You certainly can't argue yourself out of it, for example. It seems like a fundamental element of experience. Okay, so that's two places. We also have no account in the subjective-objective breakup, bifurcation of the world. We have no explanation whatsoever for consciousness. And that seems like a big problem, right? Because you can make a case that there's no being without consciousness. Like, is there something if there's no one there to perceive it? By the way, that is not the same question as if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? It's not the same question. It sounds superficially the same, but this is a much more complex question because we don't know, for example, if we don't know the relationship between time and consciousness. Like, we have a certain perception of time, we have a certain temporal realm within which we exist. Our refresh rate for our vision, for example, is about 60 hertz, which is why you can see computer screens flicker if they have a refresh rate that's slower than that. So 60 hertz to us looks continuous, but you know, there's a lot of microseconds in a second, and for a computer, especially a fast processing computer that can do maybe 1 trillion operations a second, if it was watching, so to speak, a movie, it would just see a picture, still picture that was there forever, and then another still picture that was there forever, and like it wouldn't have the impression of continuous movement. So there's this weird subjective element to time that's very difficult to understand.